The first time I saw the Wallace house, I thought it looked like something trying to remember how to breathe. The windows glinted in the afternoon light, but the shutters stayed closed, as if the house itself disliked being looked at. I parked by the iron gate and sat there a moment, fingers gripping the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick down. It had taken me 3 buses to get there, and my stomach still hummed with their diesel rhythm. A tall hedge ran along the drive. Beyond it, the roofline dipped like a folded hand. It wasn't a mansion, not exactly, just a big, careful house, old enough to have habits. I stepped out, straightened my uniform, and told myself it was just another job. Mrs. Wallace opened the door before I even knocked. She had the sort of posture that made you want to stand up straighter. Her voice carried the softness of money, rounded edges, nothing wasted. "You must be Elena," she said. "Come in, dear." The foyer smelled faintly of polish and lilies. Everything shone, the banister, the framed photographs, even the air. My shoes squeaked once against the marble floor, and I wanted to apologize to it. She led me through the rooms in a practiced loop, pointing with graceful, minimal movements. "Kitchen here, laundry through that door. The dining room, never used the sideboard, it's antique." Her words came like measured steps in a waltz. At the end of the hall we stopped. A long, narrow corridor stretched ahead, lined with doors that all looked identical, except one. It was darker, heavier, as if carved from a different kind of wood. Mrs. Wallace's hand rested on the knob for just a second before she turned to me. "This door stays closed," she said. Her tone didn't rise or harden. It simply ended the conversation. "Yes, ma'am." She smiled politely and moved on. But something in me marked the moment. The way her shoulders stiffened as we passed, the slight tremor in her breath. The rest of the tour blurred, a spotless kitchen, 2 sitting rooms, the boys' bedroom upstairs. When we reached the back porch, she turned to me again. The next morning, the quiet hit me differently. In most homes, you can hear the pulse of life. Television murmurs, footsteps upstairs, a dog shifting its weight. But here, the silence felt pressurized, like sound would have to ask permission to exist. I cleaned carefully, wiping surfaces that already looked like mirrors. Dust never had the nerve to settle. Around noon, Mrs. Wallace stepped out for errands. The boy followed her chatter to the car, and then the house belonged to me. I liked that hour, freedom disguised as routine. I moved from room to room, humming under my breath. When I reached the corridor, my hum stopped. It wasn't fear exactly, just a sudden sense of trespassing. The door waited at the end, absorbing light. I could see my own reflection in its lacquered surface, a faint blur of motion. I passed it quickly, but the thought stayed. What kind of room needs that much silence to guard it? Late that afternoon, while folding laundry in the guest room, I heard something soft. A faint rhythmic sound, like the tap of fingertips on wood. I paused, listened. Nothing. Then again, 3 taps. I told myself it was the pipes. Old houses sigh. They twitch in their bones when the air shifts. I went back to folding. Still, when I left for the evening, I caught myself glancing down that hallway one more time. The light there always seemed dimmer, as if the bulbs tired quicker. The second week began with rain, the kind that twitches against windows and turns the world into a wet sketch. I arrived early, my jacket clinging to my arms, and found the notebook on the counter, the date underlined twice. Mrs. Wallace had added a list longer than usual, but in the margin she'd written, "Thank you for your attention to detail." It felt like an expensive compliment. something you place on a shelf and dust around. Ethan shuffled in wearing socks that didn't match. He offered me a solemn strawberry from the bowl, like a truce or a ritual. "Mom says I can help you today," he told me, and I told him he could help by eating the strawberry before it stained the rug. He laughed around the fruit, red gathering at the corner of his mouth, and I handed him a napkin. There was something gentle about him, the way careful children grow up in houses where the air is always listening. Mrs. Wallace emerged a few minutes later, composed and bright. She touched Ethan's shoulder, the contact light as a brushstroke. "Darling, shoes!" He disappeared. She and I discussed the list: silver polish, linen pressing, rearranging the pantry so labels faced the same way. She didn't sound fussy. She sounded like someone who had learned that order could anchor a day. When they left for school and errands, I moved through the rooms with my quiet choreography. The pantry labels turned until every brand name looked forward like a row of soldiers. The silver woke under the cloth. Small moons appeared on the surface before they vanished into shine. The linens surrendered their creases to steam. I thought about the homes I'd worked in where the towels were a peace treaty no one had signed. By noon, the house had fallen into its unbreathing silence. Outside, rain shook the hydrangeas. Inside, the grandfather clock in the hallway insisted time was moving, even when the rooms didn't seem to agree. I paused at the doorway of the sitting room and listened for the little things: appliances thinking, wood expanding, the forgotten drip of a faucet. All I heard was the clock and the soft drag of my own breath. I stood, laundry falling from my hands. The tapping stopped. Outside, a gust shoved the rain harder against the glass. The house seemed to hunch its shoulders. I stepped into the hall and waited. The clock answered for the silence. Tuck, tuck, tuck. I told myself old houses collect secrets in their walls the way trees collect rings. I didn't go any closer. I returned to the laundry, folded deliberately, and placed the shirts into smooth, obedient stacks. That night, on the bus home, I watched the neighborhoods change: the small porches and plastic toys, the block of empty storefronts, the slice of community garden where someone's scarecrow leaned like a tired friend. I thought about the Wallace house and the way a place can choose a temperature for your thoughts. I slept lightly and dreamed of dark wood and neatly looped handwriting that wouldn't stop underlining itself. On Thursday, Ethan left me a note of his own, a crayon drawing of a son wearing sunglasses, labeled in careful, shaky letters. "Thank you, Elena." He dotted the A with a star. I put it in the pocket of my apron, a small shield I could carry, and I checked the date in the notebook again, just to see the underlines. At lunch, I stepped onto the porch with a thermos and listened to the rain slow into a mist. From that angle, the house's windows were blank, like unsent letters. A sound rose from the yard, a single bird testing its voice, then deciding against it. When I went back inside, the chilled quiet folded over me again. My footsteps felt too loud, so I softened them. In the afternoon, I noticed it for the first time: a small envelope on the floor just beyond the heavy door. White, thick paper. The kind you use when you want a message to feel more serious than it is. It lay half-tucked beneath the frame, as if it had slid from inside and run out of momentum. I stared at it, and a dozen practical explanations arranged themselves like silverware. Drafts move things. Old houses belch paper from forgotten drawers. There's no inside slot here. The gap under the door is wider than it looks. Maybe someone dropped mail and kicked it by accident. I took a breath and I felt the temperature in my chest change. For a long moment I stood there, the card open like a mouth, waiting for the rest of the sentence. The house offered me nothing, no pipe shifting, no distant call, no door settling in its frame, just the clock insisting. I put the card back into the envelope and carried it to the kitchen with ceremonial slowness, as if speed might upset it. On the counter, next to the notebook, I placed the envelope and then placed my hand on top of it, as though I were calming a startled animal. The notebook sat open to the list: white baseboards, rotate pantry stock, check batteries and smoke alarms. Something in me wanted to write down the word I'd seen, to give it a line on the list where it might be solved. Instead, I closed the cover gently. When Mrs. Wallace returned, a whisper of perfume first, then the sound of her keys, I was rinsing the sink. She thanked me for the pantry, praised the sparkle of the faucets, and slipped into a conversation about school donations, the right way to label shoeboxes for a charity drive. Her voice smoothed the day into rose. The envelope sat in clear sight. She didn't look at it. I tried once, carefully. "There was an envelope in the hallway," I said. "It looked misplaced." She glanced up, smiled in the practiced way of people who understand how to keep conversations from spilling. "Oh, likely something from last week's mail." She lifted the envelope without reading it and slid it into the side drawer with menus and coupons. "Thank you." There was no room left for the subject in her tone. I nodded and asked whether the guest room sheet should be rotated or laundered. She chose rotated. The evening unfolded itself into ordinary tasks. Later, as I left, I saw Ethan on the stairs with a science book held upside down. He righted it when he saw me watching, and I winked. "Good night, Miss Elena," he said, careful with the honorific, careful with everything. His socks still didn't match. On Friday, the sky peeled open into a brittle blue. The notebook's list was shorter. There was coffee waiting for me, already poured. The mug had a hairline cracked near the rim, a single tiny lightning bolt. I ran my finger along it and thought about how some things break so slowly you can pretend they haven't yet. When the house went still again, I found myself inventing errands far from the corridor. The coat closet needed reorganizing. The freezer begged for inventory. The spice drawer wanted truth and reconciliation. I labeled things that had never applied for names. In the afternoon, I forced myself to dust the hallway pictures, a ceremony of frames and fixed faces. There were photos of beaches that held the light too tightly, birthdays with cake that looked like white noise, and one picture of the three of them in front of the house, Mrs. Wallace centered, Mr. Wallace half-turned as if mid-thought, Ethan leaning forward at the edge of the frame like a boy trying to escape his own clothes. I saved the heavy door for last. I dusted the doors around it and then approached it like a skittish horse. At close range, the wood smelled faintly of lemon oil and something older. Old closets, old trunks, the wool memory of coats that remember other winters. My reflection in the lacquer had gone hazy, the way mirrors betray you when you want certainty. I ran the cloth lightly over the panels, careful not to let the knob turn under my hand, and told myself that good help respects boundaries even when they aren't explained. As I stepped away, a small vibration traveled through the floorboards, the kind you feel more than hear. Somewhere, a window settled. Somewhere, the furnace remembered it was a heart. I told myself the house was speaking its language, timbers, nails, temperature. I told myself the envelope had been a misfiled scrap. I told myself many things that fit neatly into sentences. When I reached the kitchen, the notebook waited for my check marks. I lifted the pen, paused, and then the margin where two underlines still pressed together from earlier in the week, I folded the silence into a tidy shape and wrote nothing at all. That night, I dreamed of a hallway that kept growing longer as I walked, each door a repetition of the last. At the end, a window with no view. I woke with the taste of dust at the back of my throat and the certainty that the mind, when it can't decide what's true, will invent a room to hold its questions. Monday came clear and unremarkable, the kind of day the calendar shrugs at. I unlocked the back door with the familiarity of routine and found a new list waiting. Light bulbs, tub grout, piano keys, Ethan's bookshelf. The last item made me smile. In the living room, the piano's lid yawned politely when I lifted it. I ran a damp cloth across the keys, one by one. Their faint, chalky feel left a pattern on my fingertips, like a secret code. I was replacing a bulb in the hallway sconce when I heard a soft scrape, paper whispering against wood. I turned. At the foot of the heavy door, another envelope rested like an apostrophe. I held very still, as if whatever had placed it might be waiting to see if I deserved it. The furnace clicked off. The house held its breath with me. I took 3 slow steps, reached down, and picked it up. It was heavier than the last. Inside, a card again, the same thick stock. 3 words this time, written with the same steady pressure. Please help me. I stared at them long enough for the letters to blur and resolve again, as if the page were breathing and I had to match its rhythm or I'd lose it. The ink had bled a little at the tips where the pen had paused, hesitation captured forever. I pressed my thumb to the paper and felt the grain rise against my skin. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I wanted proof it wasn't something my mind had printed on a blank card. Texture can feel like truth when you're afraid to ask for any. I slid the card back into the envelope and tucked the envelope into the pocket, sewn on the inside of my apron, the pocket for clips and safety pins, and the small human problems that can be mended with pressure and a sharp metal tooth. The house was quiet, but quiet in that way a sleeping animal is, still, yet occupied. I finished replacing the bulb in the sconce and told myself I would mention it to Mrs. Wallace when she got home. I rehearsed the sentence. There was another envelope by the door. The line sounded clean and obedient in my head. It didn't include my heart rate or the way my fingers kept finding the envelope's edges, as if they could learn the shape of fear by touch. I kept moving. Movement is a kind of grammar houses understand. If you keep your verb steady, your thoughts won't fall out of the sentence. I wiped grout with a brush until my elbow ached. I arranged books on Ethan's shelf by height, and then by color, and then, because guilt pricked me for caring about the wrong details, by subject. He had a stack of thin astronomy books with shiny planets that looked like polished fruit. One page had a sticky note. Saturn, favorite. 2 exclamation marks, a child's optimism writ like a flare. I closed the book and put it on eye level, where favorites should live. By the time the garage door sighed open, I had almost convinced myself the envelope could be an apology for something I didn't understand, or a leftover scrap from some other crisis in some other house that had somehow floated here along the currents of domestic air. I reheated the soup Mrs. Wallace had left instructions for, and set bowls on the counter with the neatness she liked. She swept in with grocery bags and that mild, precise smile that arranged itself without help from Joy. "You're a marvel," she said, eyes taking a quick inventory. Clean counters. Ethan stumbled in a minute later with a cereal box he had convinced his mother to buy despite a cartoon animal that looked like it would rot teeth on contact. "Miss Elena, if you put a potato in space, it would freeze and then explode," he announced, which made me laugh in the way that was less about potatoes and more about needing to land somewhere softer than the word help. I told him I hoped no one was sending potatoes to their deaths, and he nodded gravely and asked for a spoon. We moved through dinner prep like a small orchestra that had practiced together. Mrs. Wallace corrected nothing I did, and the absence of correction felt like a compliment too careful to unwrap. When I finally said, "There was another envelope in the hallway," another, as if she were trying to locate the first inside a drawer of identical forks, my mouth went ahead without my permission. It had writing in it. Her eyes touched my face and then returned to the cutting board. What did it say? There was the smallest of pauses before say, an extra blink, a thread pulled one loop farther than necessary. Just Please help me. I thought maybe it was for you. I heard how it sounded and hated the way a sentence can make you complicit just because you had to speak it. She placed the knife down, safer than it needed to be, blade turned toward her palm. People leave things, she said, voice even. Sometimes notes get mixed into mailers. Sometimes catalogs include odd things. It's a marketing tactic, I'm told. She picked up the knife again, lifted her chin by a millimeter without actually moving it, and smiled. If you see any more, just put them in the drawer. I knew then I would not put any more in the drawer. Of course, I said, and because she had settled the matter with a tone, not an explanation, the conversation ended of its own accord. She asked about the grout. I said it was stubborn but not unmanageable. She said, like most things. That night, on the bus home, I took the envelope from my apron and slid it into the lining of my bag. It felt wrong to carry it like a secret, and wronger to leave it behind before it had a place to be. At home, I set it on my small table under the succulents I tended because they forgave neglect, and I looked at it while I ate noodles. After, I took out the first envelope, the one with only help, from the drawer where I had tucked it. I placed the two side by side like family photos. I thought about handwriting, how it is a fingerprint of the nervous system. The letters matched. The E made like a comb, the P with a stem that leaned forward like a person eager to leave. Whoever wrote them did so with care and pressure. But the second showed more... insistence isn't the right word. More commitment to the line. I imagined a pen pressed down hard on a flat surface, someone standing because there was no chair to sit in, or because sitting would mean admitting there was time. I told myself a story that required no haunted rooms. Perhaps the house had belonged to someone else. Perhaps there had been a caregiver before me who wrote notes to herself and slid them under a door to feel, for a second, like someone on the other side could answer. A practice run at asking for relief. People save strange artifacts of their worst days. Later, those artifacts become puzzles for whoever finds them. We want to solve puzzles because it's easier than sitting next to the unsolved person we were then. I put both envelopes back in my bag and slept badly. The next day, Mrs. Wallace included a line in the notebook that hadn't appeared before. Please dust the baseboards in the upstairs landing. Be careful near the last door on the right. She could have written the heavy door. She didn't. That's how careful people are when they're building a structure inside their own heads. They don't give the beams names in case someone recognizes the floor plan. Ethan ate toast with honey and told me that astronauts sometimes grow taller in space because their spines stretch without gravity, which sounded like a gorgeous lie and a truth I could feel in my back. Mr. Wallace came down in a shirt that needed exactly one more pass from an iron. He smelled faintly of aftershave and a kind of fatigue that looked like it had taken a seat behind his eyes and refused to leave. Good morning, Elena, he said. He said my name as if he had to find it on an internal list first. He poured coffee, added nothing to it, and stood in the middle of the kitchen as if kitchens were foreign countries and he had lost his phrase book. Before he left, he touched the notebook with 2 fingers, not to move it, but to acknowledge its rule over the... Upstairs, I knelt on the landing and ran my cloth along the line where paint met floor. Dust gathered in obedient gray ropes and wrapped itself around the base of the cloth like a small animal finding a lap. I saved the last door on the right for last because rituals give shape to fear. When I shuffled toward it on my knees, I felt ridiculous and small and somehow more fitting for the proximity. The brass knob threw back a warped version of my face. I dusted the baseboard without letting my shoulder touch the wood. It was colder there, though that could have been the angle I had put my body in. When I stood, my knee cracked loudly in the quiet and I flinched, which made me laugh softly at myself, a balm of a sound. As I turned to go, I looked down and saw a thread on the floor that hadn't been there the day before. It was pink, the soft kind you find on baby blankets and sweaters meant for skin that has not yet learned about abrasion. It could have come from anything. For a second, a single, shameless second, I put it against my lower lip to feel the way softness can lie. Then I put it in my pocket because throwing it away felt like erasing someone else's gentleness. At lunch, Mrs. Wallace told me she would be away for the weekend. "A fundraising conference," she said, the way people say dentist. "Friday through Sunday. My husband will be away as well." She took a breath that expanded, then edited itself smaller. "Would you be willing to come Saturday for a half day? Just to air the rooms, water the hydrangeas if it's warm, make sure there's nothing undone." The pause before undone was shorter than a word and longer than a sigh. "Ethan will be with his grandmother." "Yes," I said, "of course." I liked empty houses not because they were empty, but because they were honest about their loneliness. A house without people doesn't pretend. It just waits. Friday evening, when I left, the sky had gathered itself into dark corners. Wind threaded the hedge and found its own way out again. I waited for the bus and watched the house from the stop. One upstairs window glowed. Someone moved behind it, a small eclipse. It could have been anybody. We assign meaning to shadows when we need a place to put the fears we don't have names for. The bus came and took me. I opened the windows. Warm air shouldered in, carrying yellow. Bird sounds felt farther away than they were. The refrigerator had a jar of olives with a date that made me wince. I threw them out and told the trash not to tell. I changed guest towels that looked exactly like fresh towels and vacuumed around furniture that resented being moved, even when it only moved an inch. By noon, the house had settled into its most honest version of itself. The clock sounded less like a heart and more like a metronome. I ate a sandwich in the kitchen and looked out at the hydrangeas, which don't need much beyond a human to call them beautiful once in a while. They make their own drama. I told myself I wasn't going down the hallway. Then I found myself wiping the already wiped frames and thinking about how frames are the only part of a picture that looks you in the eye. By the time I reached the landing, I had agreed with nothing and promised myself little. The heavy door waited with all the patience of a thing that knows you've already decided. I stood in front of it and put my hand flat on the wood. It should have been cool. It was not. It was the temperature of whatever you imagine when you think the word caught. I took my hand away, embarrassed by my own melodrama, angry at my pulse for performing. I don't know what I expected to hear. Something. Anything. Instead, I heard the low sigh of the air conditioner turning on, and somewhere a vent adjusting itself. The house aligning joints like a sleeper rolling over. I backed away and made it to the top stair before I realized I had been holding my breath. I let it go, and it carried something with it I can only call the first draft of a decision. I went downstairs and sat on the bottom step and thought about rules. Rules are not laws. They are agreements between two people that only one of them often remembers signing. This door stays closed. She had said it the way one says, we don't talk about that person, or we don't use that word. The kind of rule whose enforcement was her responsibility, not mine. And yet here I was, the new enforcer, deputized by proximity, uniformed by an apron that smelled like lemon and control. I pulled at the heavy door. I bent to the gap at the bottom and looked for light. There was none. I listened for breath because that's what we listen for when we are unsure whether something is alive. I heard the indifferent whisper of air through ducts. I told myself I would not touch the knob. I told myself that even if I did, that was not opening a door. A hand on a knob is just a person declaring she knows where her hands end and the world begins. I placed my fingers around it. Brass is good at sending messages from other people's hands. This one sent the chill of the house back into my palm. The latch felt firm. I stood there for the length of a story I didn't yet know how to tell, and then I took my hand away, because what I could live with mattered more than what I could stand. In the afternoon, I trimmed the couple of brown leaves on the hydrangeas, even though that wasn't on the list, and I sat on the back steps and let the sun press its apology into my shoulders. When I locked the door and left, the house accepted the click with the calm of a thing waiting for the next click to undo it. Sunday, Mrs. Wallace called. "Thank you for going in," she said, as if she had asked me to check on a cat. "Everything all right?" "Yes," I said. "Everything's fine." "Good." The pause this time was not quite silence. "Elena, I appreciate your professionalism." It wasn't a word that belonged between us. It sounded like a ribbon pinned to my shirt with a needle sharp enough to draw blood if I breathed wrong. "See you Monday." "See you Monday," I said, and when the call ended, the air in my apartment felt too bright, as if someone had left the light on inside a cupboard and forgotten to close the door. Monday came with a blue sky I did not trust. The notebook had returned to its post on the counter, the handwriting a little more compressed than usual. Lists shrink when minds do. The last item read, "Please avoid the upstairs hallway today. Floor varnish may still be tacky." It hadn't smelled of varnish on Saturday. I nodded to no one and took it as a kindness, an invitation to obey and keep my distance and therefore my soul. Ethan told me a joke that was mostly set up and no punchline, my favorite kind because by late morning, I had cleaned everything that could be cleaned without marching past the sentence about varnish. I found myself in the music room again, dusting keys that did not complain. I pressed one softly, and the note felt like a breath held and then honored. I thought about scales, how they are the most patient of practices, each finger learning to remember, then to forget that it remembers, so it can move like water. My hands are good at remembering and terrible at forgetting. It is not a skill employers ask about, but it is one that matters when you are paid to become what a house requires. At noon, I heard footsteps on the porch and expected the postman. Instead, there was a knock, two short, one long. I wiped my hands and opened the door to a woman with a paper bag of muffins and a look that had learned to sit in her face for long days. She was in her 50s, maybe, hair pulled back with a clip that had lost teeth. "You must be Elena," she said, and by the way she said my name, I knew she had rehearsed it. "I'm Gita. I live across the way." She tilted her head toward a house I had never really seen because I didn't look outward much from here. "I bring muffins when they look thin." I must have frowned because she added quickly, "The weekends tire them out." I took the bag and the warmth in it and thanked her. "I'll put these out," I said. I meant on a plate, for show and then for eating. She stepped forward a fraction, the way people do when they want to look past you without being impolite. "Is Mrs. Wallace home?" "She's out at the moment," I said. "Errands." The default answer that keeps the dignity of the absent. Gita nodded. "Of course." She tipped her chin at the ceiling like a bird listening underground. "You know how old houses hold sound?" This one holds silence, makes the other kind louder. She smiled in a way that comforted and warned. "Tell her I stopped by." She started to leave, then turned back. "If you ever need anything." Later, while rotating the pantry stock I had already rotated twice, I found a small wooden box behind the flour. The kind that used to hold cigarettes or treasures you'd pretend were cigarettes if you were 14 and trying to be complicated. It wasn't locked. Inside, a music box mechanism gleamed with the practicality of engineered joy. The crank had a delicacy that made me want to be gentle even before I touched it. I turned it once, and it released a melody I half recognized from a line in a lullaby people used to sing to children when the world was certain it could keep them. I stopped the crank. The sound shut off like a light. I replaced the box exactly as I had found it and told myself this: it belongs to no room until someone puts it there. The thought comforted me more than it should have. Tuesday morning, the plumber arrived and smelled like machine oil and rain. He crouched under the sink and spoke to the pipes the way a person speaks to a dog they don't know yet but want to. "There you are," he said to a joint that had loosened itself. I liked him for that. He charged a price that sounded like it had been rounded down inside his mouth before it came out. When he left, the sink sighed into functioning with an almost comic exaggeration, as if to prove its worth. In the afternoon, Ethan and I played a game where I put 2 spoons on the counter and he had to explain the philosophical differences between them without using the words bigger or smaller. He struggled and then arrived at, "This one looks like it knows more about soup." We both clapped because it was true. He asked then, staring not at me but at the middle distance where children store their riskier questions. "Do you think I had a sister?" The question was a leaf falling in a room where there are no trees. I swallowed wrong and the world hiccuped. "Why do you ask that?" He shrugged. Big shrug for a small body. "Sometimes Mom looks at me and then looks at not me. Like somebody else is standing behind me. And once I found a dress in the closet that wouldn't fit any of us, not even the cat, if we had one." He laughed to make it sound like a joke. "Dad said it was a present for a friend's baby, and then I never saw it again." And I went to the pantry because I could not stand the weight of his claim, combined with the unused truth that might live behind a door I had not opened. That evening, as I left, I saw Mr. Wallace sitting in his car in the driveway, engine off, hands on the wheel. He didn't look at the house. He looked at the place where the hood meets the windshield, the car's sternum. I paused by the hedge and pretended to adjust my bag strap. After a long minute, he took his hands off the wheel and placed them, empty, on his knees. Then he turned the key, backed out, and left. I wanted to be unkind about it. I failed. It is a difficult thing to drive toward your own kitchen when grief might be standing by the sink. Wednesday brought another line in the notebook I hadn't seen before. "Please do not move the box behind the flower." It did not specify what box. It did not need to. She had looked and she had known and she had given me a rule, so she would not need to explain the need for the rule. I put my hand on the counter and felt the cool of the stone as if it could steady thought. "Of course," I said to the empty room, and meant it, and also didn't. In the late afternoon, while I was wiping fingerprints that weren't there from the stainless steel fridge door, fingerprints are the most innocent crimes, Gita waved from her kitchen window across the way. I waved back, and she made a questioning motion with her hand, a little tilt. "Are you okay?" I nodded. She held up a lemon like a sun, and I laughed. Then she went back to her pretending to read, and I went back to pretending the house was just a house. Thursday night it rained again. The hydrangeas accepted it with their quiet extravagance. The gutter made a noise like someone practicing a stutter. I closed the windows and the house inhaled itself. In the hall, the air had a different thickness, like fabric laid over furniture to keep dust from settling in its shape. I stood at the top of the stairs and felt that same invisible draft that had been with me. At the heavy door, I placed my palm flat, then moved it to the frame, then to the seam where wood meets wood. The varnish's gloss had a few faint scratches, cat scratches, made by a being with a mind to get in or out. I bent and placed my ear to the seam and listened to wood. Wood speaks of expansion and contraction, of humidity and time, of the dense quiet objects make when they are assembled to keep weather from wrecking what it loves. I heard only that. And beneath it, if I am being honest, the memory of the lullaby from the box, which is not hearing but remembering you heard. My hand went to the knob because hands are true to their thinking even when mouths are not. I did not turn it. I waited until the foolish part of me had finished picturing the inside, which is to say, I waited until I could refuse to be ruled by the picture. Then I took my hand away and used it to grip the rail and pull my body upright and ask it to go upstairs and put fresh pillowcases on Ethan's bed, because that was a kindness that could be done, and the other was a kindness that may not have been mine to give. Friday morning, the house gave me back my restraint, like a marble I had lent it. The list was ordinary. My pulse remembered how to hide inside my wrist where it belonged, and work felt like work again. Halfway through dusting the living room shelves, I bumped an album that had been tucked behind a row of no longer read hardbacks. It fell onto the sofa with a sigh of released dust. The cover had been handled often. The leather had learned the shape of fingers. I should have put it back. I opened it. Photographs had been slipped into the paper sleeves with the care of a person who believes carefulness can fix what happens to a life when no one is watching. The first pages were the standard liturgy. Smiling couple, new house, birthdays where everyone looks into the camera because it is proof they existed on the same day. Then, later, smaller frames, lighter exposure. A baby, round and astonished. The baby again in a blue knitted hat with ears. The baby in a dress with a collar edged like a cloud. On one page, a lock of hair taped down, with the tape yellowing at the edges. There was a name embossed at the bottom of the page in those stick-on letters from craft stores. Lila. I didn't move for long in a room where the only monster is time. That afternoon, when Mrs. Wallace came home, she looked thinner and also more solid, like someone who has made a hard choice and intends to live with the exact weight of it. "Everything all right?" she asked, as always. "Yes," I said, and we stood in the kitchen, two women not exactly facing each other. The album back where it belonged, the box behind the flower, the envelopes in my bag, the name Lila added to the parish of my thoughts. I wanted to say I was sorry for something no one had asked me to be sorry about. I wanted to say that sometimes the kindest help is staying on your own side of a door. I wanted to ask if there was anything at all she needed from me that wasn't listed on paper. Instead, I told her the plumber had come and the leak was fixed and the hydrangeas were thriving. She nodded and then, unexpectedly, reached across the counter and touched my wrist. It was brief, fingers cool, then gone. "Thank you," she said. And there was in it a small shift, a sanding down of distance. It made me want to cry, and I didn't. When I left that evening, the sky was a fragile blue and the air smelled like a memory of rain, rather than rain itself. I walked to the bus stop and looked back at the windows. The upstairs ones reflected the light in flat panes. Behind one, a curtain moved. It could have been air. It could have been any number of benign things. I didn't inventory them. I let the curtain move. I let the house be a house. On the bus, I took out the envelopes again because carrying them was a burden that felt like a task, and tasks feel better than burdens that don't. I considered writing back, on a blank card, with my careful hand, "I see you," or "I'm here," or "I can't, but I want to." But to whom and to what end? Help is a verb with a legal department. It requires consent and a plan, not just a door and a feeling. I put the envelopes away and held the pole and watched the city sluice by in sheets of moving glass. In the reflection, my face looked more like a person who knows something and less like a person who is pretending she doesn't. It wasn't a flattering change, and it wasn't an unflattering one. It was simply a direction. When I unlocked my apartment, I placed the envelopes side by side on the table again and sat with them while the kettle did its small thunder. I wrote nothing. I said nothing. I let the letters exist in the air between us until they lost some of their urgency and became paper again. Then I put them away, washed my face, and went to bed with the feeling that part of me had stepped somewhere its shoes weren't made for and learned to balance anyway. The next morning, I arrived early, more for me than for them. The house received me with the same even temperature, the same absent-shaped quiet. The notebook's list was short. At the bottom, the first unambiguous command I had seen from her since the day of the tour. Elena, please do not open the last door on the right, not for any reason. Under it, a small, careful thank you. I stood there with the pen in my hand and thought about how she had written my name, how names tied to requests add weight. I initialed beside the plumber note and watered the fern by the window and ironed the pillowcases into small, absolute rectangles. I obeyed the command. I obeyed it because it was given to me, not because it was carved into the house, and yet the sentences in my head rearranged themselves into a new grammar. There are rules we follow because we are good, and there are rules we follow because someone else would break in us if we didn't. Somewhere between those two is the place where a hand learns to touch a knob and then let go. That place is where I was standing when the next thing happened, the thing that would make all my rehearsed sentences useless, that would shake loose the stories I had used to keep my mind quiet. It did not announce itself with a sound from behind the door or a note slid under it. It announced itself from the hallway's other end, as ordinary as a voice speaking your name in daylight. "Miss Elena?" Ethan said, and when I turned, he was there, with his hands on the straps of his backpack, his face careful, his mouth set in a brave line that only children and people in uniforms can make convincingly. "Can I show you something?" "Of course," I said, and only later would I think about how, of course, is the beginning of so many small disasters and small salvations. He led me not upstairs, but into the dining room, to the built-in cabinet with the glass doors that reflected both of us, the boy and the woman, trying to be large enough to keep him from catching adult weather. He pointed to the bottom drawer. "I found something. I wasn't snooping," he added quickly, which is how you know a person has been following curiosity to its only available end. I opened the drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of placemats printed with lemons that matched my dish towel narrative too perfectly to be coincidence, lay a folder. It was labeled in Mrs. Wallace's tidy hand, Records. The label was too general to be useful and too specific to be ignored. I glanced at Ethan. "Should I be looking at this?" He bit his lip. "Dad said I'm not supposed to open anything that isn't mine." "But you're a grown-up. No one knows what to open. We pretend, and the pretending saves us or ruins us by degrees." I slid the folder out, partly to show him that adults are not afraid of paper, partly because my hands were already doing it. Inside were hospital documents, admissions forms, a sonogram printed on paper that had faded to a gray like old rain, discharge summaries, a birth certificate with the name Lila Mae Wallace and dates that cast their own kind of shadows, a death certificate that used the phrase sudden infant death syndrome with a cold that made me angry at the letters for holding together so well. Ethan looked at the page as if he were learning a piece of math he would not be asked to put on a test. He didn't ask what it meant. He read the dates. He is 9. Numbers tell the story to 9-year-olds first. His mouth tightened. He nodded once to himself, and then stepped back like he had just realized he was standing on a thing that knew more than he did. I slid the papers back into the folder, and then the folder back into the drawer and closed it, and put my hand on the wood the way one does when one hopes the tree will forgive the cabinet. We stood there without speaking. Through the glass, our reflections waited, patient and a little thinner. "Thank you for showing me," I said. He nodded, not looking at me. "I think Mom keeps the door shut because sometimes doors help you remember how to forget things," he said, with the odd, perfect clarity children sometimes stab us with. And sometimes it helps her breathe when it's shut. Yes, I said, because yes was the only answer that did not violate anything. He turned then and went to the kitchen and asked for a muffin in a voice that didn't wobble. I gave him one, and he ate it with small, grateful bites, the kind people take when they know they are pretending to be normal and their body is helping. When Mrs. Wallace came home that afternoon, Ethan was in his room making Saturn out of cardboard. I stood at the counter with a sponge in my hand and a new understanding sitting on the shelf beside the lemons. She set her keys down with their usual quiet and looked at me and looked at the notebook, and then, for the first time, looked at my face long enough. That evening I stayed while she took phone calls in the study, and the house turned its own corners toward night. I folded towels and lined them up in the bathroom like arguments for order. I put the music box behind the flower back without touching it, even though my entire body wanted to wind it once, just once, to hear whether the lullaby sounded different in the dark. And then, just as the clock agreed with itself about the hour, the upstairs hallway light clicked on. It was the kind of sound houses make all the time, electric, practical. But that night it carried a different weight for me because I had filled too many blanks with my own ink. I lifted my head. The light stayed, steady, not flickering, not theatrical. A simple, factual illumination. A person had turned it on. There would be footsteps. There would be choices. There would not be monsters. I wiped my hands one last time on the towel and placed it on the counter in a square. Then I walked toward the stairs, my knees measuring out a rhythm my mind could hold. At the top, I paused. The varnish was not tacky. The air smelled like wood, and a perfume I couldn't name because it was made of clean and memory, not flowers. The last door on the right stood closed. Behind me, soft steps. I turned. Mrs. Wallace, her face arranged down to the smallest muscle. She looked at me and then at the door and then back at me. Something complicated moved through her gaze and settled. She nodded very slightly. It wasn't permission to open anything. It was permission to stand where I stood without apology. "Thank you for staying late," she said. Her voice had no tremor. "I'll see you tomorrow." She turned off the hallway light and we both stood in the dark for one breath. Then she went downstairs and I followed, and the door remained as it was, and the house, full of its people, full of its rules, kept being a house. I lay awake later, listening to my upstairs neighbor's footsteps pacing the length of their life. And I thought about the plainest truth I had touched all week. Sometimes help is a door. Saturday rose pale and undecided, the kind of morning that forgets whether it promised sun. I let myself in with the house key and felt the weight of it more than usual, as if metal could measure expectation. The notebook wasn't on the counter. A small square of paper stood in for authority. Windows 10 minutes. Hydrangeas if hot. Change guest towels. Vacuum downstairs only. The last line had been erased, leaving a gray smudge like breath on glass. I didn't try to read it. There are permissions that come only from not knowing. The rooms held their careful shapes. Chairs facing the idea of a conversation. A throw folded into an obedient rectangle. The piano with its lid closed. A mouth that had decided silence counted as speech. I opened windows and let the day step in. Air moved across the floors with the diffidence of a guest who doesn't take off their shoes. Outside, a lawnmower droned 3 houses away. Someone else's certainty about what to do with a Saturday. I walked the perimeter like a night guard who had come on too early. Stove off, candles unlit, dishwasher blinking its small green reassurance. The house gave back nothing unusual, which is its own kind of message. In the pantry, I touched nothing behind the flour. In the dining room, I straightened a placemat that would have fooled anyone but me into thinking it had already been straight. I was grateful for the lie. By noon, the light had decided on itself. It fell through the windows in polite rectangles and lay on the floors like well-behaved dogs. I ate a sandwich at the counter and watched dust perform in the air, the way dust always does when it's certain no one will call it by its name. The refrigerator had surrendered its oldest jars to the bin. Olives so far past their patience they'd taken on biography. When I closed the door, I listened for the soft suction that says two surfaces have agreed to meet. It came, and my shoulders loosened a notch. Upstairs, the landing smelled faintly of furniture polish and the suggestion of perfume that clings to wood, because wood is a better archivist than people are. I didn't go to the last door on the right. The next day began with rain drawing light bars down the windows, the kind that make kitchens feel like waiting rooms. I brewed coffee and laid out 3 mugs before anyone came down. The paper she'd left, my name on the outside, the request inside, sat where I'd put it, unfolded and then refolded twice more, the creases learning their geometry. Ethan appeared first, orbiting the room with the leftover grandeur of having presented Saturn to his class. "Ms. Hotchkiss said I made the rings too strong," he said, proud of himself for breaking the rubric in the right direction. He gulped milk and ran back upstairs to find the extra credit sheet he'd already misplaced. Mr. Wallace came in next, tie clutched loosely in his hand like a confession. He nodded at me, then at the note, then away from both. He poured coffee and stood with it near the sink, not drinking, as if heat might warm him from the outside in. "Thanks for being here," he said, to the window or to me, I couldn't tell. "She sleeps a little when you're here." He left the sentence there and followed his son upstairs, a good man, with a toolbox he didn't yet know how to use. Mrs. Wallace came last. No makeup, hair pulled into a simple band, the face of a woman who had decided that today was not for performance. She touched the note with 2 fingers, not reading, reaffirming. Then she lifted her hand and set it flat on the counter, as if claiming something she had already owned. "Would you sit with me?" she asked. We went upstairs with our mugs and set them on the windowsill at the end of the hall. The chair faced the door, as it had these past days, but there were 2 of them now. She had brought up the one from the guest room and aligned it beside the first, their backs barely touching. She sat. I sat. The corridor held us like a long-held breath that had finally learned the trick of slow release. For a while we listened to the house make its honest sounds, the faint cluck of ducts waking, the old wood remembering it is elastic. Rain traveled down the gutter in small silver avalanches. "I wrote them," she said, as if we had been speaking for hours, and this was the sentence both of us had been arranging our silence around. The notes. I didn't move. I didn't tell her I knew. I didn't say why. I let the quiet catch its breath so her confession would not fall through it. "I didn't mean to frighten you," she went on. I meant to put the feeling somewhere my hands could find it. The room is a container, but sometimes a container needs another container." She laughed once, without humor. "It's ridiculous." "It's human," I said. Her eyes stayed on the seam where the door met the frame. I told myself if anyone saw it, they would know I was… What? Weak? Crazy? I told myself I'd say it was junk mail. I told myself many things. But what I meant was, please help me hold this without opening it. We sat with that wording, its carefulness and its courage. Behind us, a siren passed in the wet distance and dissolved. I can keep sitting, I said. At the end of the hall, no closer than you want. I can keep showing up and making pasta and polishing a railing that doesn't need polish. If there's ever a day you want to open it, I can sit then too. But I won't ask you to. She nodded, the kind of nod that belongs to people who have had to accept too many bargains with their own minds. Not today, she said. But perhaps one day. She glanced at me, an almost smile. Perhaps we start smaller. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and drew out the small pewter rattle. I hadn't heard her find it under the sink. Perhaps she always knew where the things in this house migrated, the way mothers know the paths children take through rooms. The ribbon was frayed where fingers had worried it. She laid the rattle in her palm and then into mine. It was cool and heavy and exactly as complicated as it looked. "Would you put this in the kitchen drawer?" she asked. "The one with the batteries and rubber bands. With the living things I carried it down while she stayed seated, 2 chairs keeping their silent vigil. In the kitchen I opened the drawer and made room between light bulbs and a tape measure and a bag of felt furniture pads that had promised to save floors from chairs and mostly had. The rattle settled among them without protest. When I closed the drawer, the sound it made was small and right. Back upstairs we sat again. She exhaled through her nose, one of those breaths you don't know you've been saving. I thought if I kept the nursery perfect, it would be an argument against time, she said, as if I could appeal the decision by maintaining the scene of it. But it turns out grief doesn't respect good housekeeping.